All right, welcome back to another episode of the Aspiring VC with your host, Matt Snow from Mass Ventures. I have Justine at Playground Global with me today. But before we get into anything too serious, Dunkin' or Starbucks, what's your preferred coffee?
I'm gonna go with Dunkin'.
Good.
I was a big Dunkin' drinker when I worked at Barclays.
Yeah, it's actually my first test for someone, big Dunkin' Northeast guy. So, you pass. So
Okay, good.
good to hear it. But, let's get like a couple minute summary. Just who are you? What's the firm you're at? And what's the role that you're in now?
Yeah, sure. So I am an investor at a fund called Playground Global. So we're based in Palo Alto, founded in 2015. So we still feel very much like a startup ourselves. We have 850 million under management across two funds. So we're on our second fund. We invest in Series Seed and Series A. So check size ranges from 1 to 20 million. And then we kind of focus on four broad verticals, but they're very broad, and we definitely have investments that don't fit neatly into these categories. But the categories are next gen compute, so things like quantum and optical computing and semiconductors. It tends to be mostly hardware in that category, and I support our portfolio there. AI automation and robotics, which tends to be focused on ag tech, supply chain, and logistics. Life sciences, which tends to be computational biology and synbio, and then software infrastructure and kind of sub areas of focus within that are ML ops and cybersecurity. We have an 80,000 square foot facility, which is what my background is, 5 labs, a bunch of equipment, a lot of startups that work out of the space when it's not a pandemic, and a dedicated operating team. So operating partners, but also hardware, software engineers, data scientists, PR designers, et cetera, that work on and publish some of their own papers, but also work with our portfolio companies closely.
And I know that anyone who's following venture closely is probably seeing the name Playground on a lot of deals and articles. But can we dive in? It sounds like there's definitely a lot of incubation and obviously an early stage focus. But is there anything else you kind of highlight about the firm's approach and maybe where it's kind of going with new funds in the future?
Yeah, sure. So I should clarify. So Fund One, is pretty different than Fund Two. So Fund One, we were an incubator model, and we focused more heavily on hardware, which tended to be consumer devices. And so Fund Two, like I said, startups can work out of our space, but we're no longer an incubator model. So it's not in exchange for equity, basically. And we do about 50-50 hardware software. So we like to say we're not afraid of hardware. And we do mostly enterprise facing investments now. I think, yes, in terms of some of the, notable investments we have, we're investors in Verta Health, Quantum. It's a really cool company that I work closely with. Next Silicon, we have some, if you can believe it, later stage, but still stealth companies that we're pretty excited about. So those are some of the notable ones that come to mind. Oh, Relativity Space is another big investment of ours.
And a big focus of the podcast here is kind of opening the doors to an opaque industry that's slowly kind of educating the masses on how everything's working. And
Yeah.
it would be great to kind of understand, dive into your origin story. I know you have a super unique background, and so just kind of explaining this kind of wild path that led you to breaking into venture.
Yeah. Sure. So I originally was a professional ballet dancer. So I graduated high school in 3 years, so I could move to Houston and dance. And I was a professional ballerina for 6 years, and then went to undergrad where I studied finance, and then ended up working at Barclays in equity research. And I was very fortunate to work in that role, covering consumer internet and telco infrastructure. So all your big Web2 platforms like Google, Facebook, Fang, basically, plus some others, and then telco infrastructure, which was kind of like a totally opposite sector to cover. It was like data centers and telecom providers, et cetera. Did the CFA program during that time, thinking that I would do research for 3 years, and at that point have the CFA charter, and then go work at a hedge fund. But through that process, realized I didn't think like a hedge fund, meaning I wasn't as interested in, what some large cap companies EPS was going to be for the quarter as I was in this one startup that I thought was going to like reshape the industry over the next 10 years. And so that's kind of when I realized venture would be probably better fit for me. And it's also around the time where I started to get interested in crypto and blockchain technology. And so thought doing my MBA would, one, enable me to move to the West Coast, two, kind of enable me to build a network and get exposed to venture, and then three, have enough time to actually try to understand what was going on with crypto and blockchain. And so that's what I did. I did my MBA at Berkeley. I used that experience as a way to kind of run small experiments like you would at an early stage startup. So I did, and I actually don't recommend this, but I did 6 internships while I did my MBA, and that was to work with a variety of different funds, but also organizations like World Economic Forum, get exposure to technology from a policy perspective. And so, yeah, I focused on venture and crypto stuff when I did my MBA, and then graduated in May virtually and joined Playground at that point.
Yeah. So, well, thank you for sharing that. And, obviously not everyone's going to be able to, do 6 internships during their
Yeah, not recommended.
But when you think back to like, I guess a lot of the networking you did, finding your passion. So I guess, kind of crypto and early stage, maybe deep tech as well. And going after these internships and jobs, like what is your practical advice for people that are kind of in the shoes that you were in when you were first starting to break into these opportunities?
Yeah, it's a good question. And so I always like caveat this with there's definitely not like one approach to venture. And so I think, there are many ways to get there. And so you have to figure out like what works for your personality and for your skill set. So I love to write. So I knew that creating content would be kind of a core part of my strategy. So I think, you need to develop unique viewpoints on different sectors that you're very interested in or passionate about, but then you need to communicate those somehow. So whether that's doing podcasts or you write content or you're just like killing it on Twitter, some of those will feel more natural to some people versus others. So writing long form content feels much better to me than like tweeting a lot. So that was part of my strategy. I think I was very focused, and this is probably because of the research background, on developing more or less expertise on an area. And so everything was kind of very domain driven for me. So I would go to a lot of like crypto conferences or was very involved in that community. And so built a network. It felt more organic to me that way because it was just, let's have a conversation about like this specific topic, as opposed to just asking somebody for time to ask them more general questions about their career. And so that's kind of how I approached it, was this thought process of, if I'm just working on really interesting things and meeting interesting people, then other VCs will be interested in chatting with me about those things. So that's not the only approach, but it was kind of my approach. And then the other thing that was like very instrumental, I think, in me moving into venture was that I was part of something called Dorm Room Fund, which is a student-run venture fund, invests in student founders, and is backed by First Round. And so that was important in that it gave me firsthand experience writing 20K checks into student founders. And so also like working closely with them, understanding like all the things that they're going through at the super early stage. And then also just getting a lot of insight into how First Round, which is definitely a top tier seed investor, thinks about investing and fund operations and all of those things. And then I also just made really close friends with the other people that were involved, who have now graduated and gone on to other funds. And so I think having that support network when you're new to this role is really important, because we're all kind of trying to figure out how to do this very undefined job together.
Yeah, definitely. And one thing I definitely wanted to dive into is, seems like you've got a really cool nexus of deep tech and crypto. And I personally, I think both of us probably feel this way. I do view crypto as part of this deep technology landscape, but I find some people in the tech community to be, if not dismissive of crypto, sometimes like outright hostile to it. So kind of
Yeah.
curious, you see that too, and what do you think about the intersection of where crypto can meet with kind of robotics and AI and these other, advanced technology sectors that we're looking at?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, I definitely think there's overlap. I also see how they're very different, and I should caveat, Playground doesn't really invest in crypto, so I'm still very involved in the community, but kind of in outside of Playground in different capacities. So, I mean, it is a deeply technical. I don't want to say technical technology, but at the core of these protocols, it is deeply technical and more at like a systems level. So it is, I think, in the category of deep tech in that way. I think there are a lot of nuances to it that are different, and so your traditional deep tech investor isn't necessarily um, going to be equipped to be like a good crypto investor in terms of like it's like a more active management strategy. There's active governance involved. I think being part of the community is really important, and also a lot of these, especially like DeFi protocols, don't need to raise a lot of funding because they're like generating a lot of cash kind of from the start. So I think that's interesting in terms of like how does it intersect with AI and robotics and all and on other deep technologies. I think that's like probably farther out. Like I really view it as like this is a new store of value. This is a new medium of exchange. This is a new financial infrastructure. So I had somebody ask me this morning actually, like, so what do you do with crypto beyond that? And I was like, what do you, I mean, what do you mean beyond that? Like that's pretty huge. Like if someone told you 2 years ago we're going to create a new form of money and a new financial infrastructure, you would have been like, okay, like that seems totally impossible. So
Yeah.
I don't know that it can, right? And there's the whole Web3, and you can create a new internet infrastructure, which is interesting and important. But I don't know that it's already like very powerful and transformational if it doesn't extend to those other things.
Yeah, there's a great illustration on this website, Visual Capitalist, that shows like all of the world's money visualized.
Yeah,
And like this little dot that's like cryptocurrency, and then you have this massive scale of financial assets and derivatives, and to some extent we don't even actually know how much is really out there the way the current system is built. So
right.
funny to have that people coming in sometimes with the dismissive views, but I think that happens with any kind of first wave of technology adopters. From what we've seen in the past. But also interested, you're supporting a lot of great early stage companies. You've now been at like 6, 7 different funds. You've ingrained yourself in some of these tech communities. Like, what impact do you want to have from your work? And also, like, what do you want to see founders doing to change the world for the better?
Yeah, yeah. So that was one thing that was really important to me when I was thinking about what types of funds I wanted to join when I graduated. Is that I really wanted to spend my time on things that I thought, matter to the world, basically. I had some late nights working at an investment bank where I didn't care that I was still there at 4 a.m., but it bothered me that I was spending that amount of time, energy, and effort on something that I didn't think was consequential. So that's what I really liked about Playground. I think the way we phrase it is that we want to invest in companies that will have multi-generational impact. And I think especially right now, I mean, there's really big global uh, problems that we need to address with urgency. And so it was important to me to be in a position to kind of allocate capital to those things. So one is just impact in that way. I think the other thing I spent a lot of time on is like improving representation and diversity in the venture industry. So I co-founded an organization called The Table, which is aimed at creating community and improving visibility for women in enterprise and deep tech. And yeah, anyways, was part of a dorm room fund program called Blueprint Project. for both founders and investors, again, aimed at increasing representation in on the investing side and also on the founding side. So it's something that's very important to me. And then I think, all the work I do with crypto is also really aimed at increasing financial inclusion and redistributing the way that value accrues, to network participants as opposed to kind of these siloed platforms, et cetera. So I think there's like a huge, it's part of the ethos is very connected to impact.
Definitely. And, I think two areas there that we have a lot of overlap, probably both individually and between the firms, is the focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, both in the capital, market process and in the technology startup creation, but also, the deep tech focus as well. And so there's probably, another thing that'd be interesting to dive into is I think you've spent time sitting at this nexus of policy and technology, policy,
Mm-hmm.
finance. And obviously, being a quasi-public firm, we're right there as well. And we've seen a lot, in the last couple of weeks. I think multiple of the teammates at Founders Fund have put out articles about, changing policy for the better to support tech. And would love to
Yep.
hear, you're on the ground floor with a lot. I would love to hear your view on that.
Yeah, so I don't have a policy background, and I would caveat this by saying I'm not a policy expert. So part of it is that this is what's really fascinating to me about emerging technologies is that, there's a whole, you have to think about it like as the entire system. Like you can have a very like revolutionary technology, but I really like thinking about how does this come out of a research lab or, out of some developer's basement or whatever, and actually become over time adopted by the mainstream. And so that involves things like regulation and policy, and enterprises, and just understanding all the stakeholders that have to be involved, and networks and building ecosystems with complementary technologies, and all these things are like what's really fascinating to me. So I had the opportunity to work to intern or be a fellow with World Economic Forum. So we were working on central bank digital currency policymaker toolkit while I was there. And that was basically helping to create a framework for, leaders at central banks and other institutions to think through the potential benefits and the potential risks of what would be involved in launching a digital currency and the different forms that could take, and the potential policy and governance issues related to that. And then I also sit in the policy and governance working group at the United Nations ITU, which is the organization that writes standards for wireless communications, again, focused on central bank digital currencies. And so the policy is really important. A lot of the big questions, especially focused on central bank digital currencies, around privacy and whether or not you can more effectively transmit monetary policy, or if there creates competition with commercial banks, et cetera, and how to address different financial stability concerns, really come down to the design and are more policy questions than technology questions. And so it's very interesting. The other thing that's very interesting about, so I think World Economic Forum is great at bridging kind of public and private sectors, and then United Nations is obviously very global. And so it's those conversations are very interesting, in that privacy, for example, is viewed very different in different regions. And so I think it's more about presenting things in a way where maybe there's a scale of privacy from 1 to 10, and then you can point out, well, an architecture like this would be a 5 on that scale, and you can choose how you feel about that.
I think this is probably a great time to bring up ethics. Probably a world without privacy and censorship resistant money is probably not a world with freedom. Certainly not financial freedom, probably not freedom of speech. How do you think, all these deep tech sectors, because they have such a massive potential impact on the world, it seems like the way the system's built now, we have great monetary incentives to bring technologies into the world, but we have the kind of foresight to think about what we're creating and how we're creating. And it sounds like you're really, you're thinking hard about systems design in a way that doesn't hurt, but actually benefits, humanity as a whole. How do you think How do you think about, this is a new like thing that's come across to me
Yeah.
recently. How do you think about ethics in tech, and where are we doing well and where are we maybe missing and have some gaps there?
Yeah. So it's a great question. I think it's really important. I'm concerned that it's not more of a front and center conversation. I think it's still somewhat of an afterthought, and I think it should be happening in the beginning of discussions. We're definitely at the point where I don't think we're constrained by technological or scientific capability. I think it is more questions of policy than technology. It is more about what are the societal implications, and or like do we even want this future? It's like awesome we can build it, but like are we sure this is what we want? So I would like to see that be more in the conversations. I think the kind of prevailing view right now is like you're not going to stop technological progress, like, and we probably shouldn't. And so the view is, well, if this is going to happen anyway, then we at least want to be able to influence the design, or we want to, we think this is the most responsible way for this to happen. And so that's the company we're going to back or whatever. But I do think it needs to be more of a priority.
Yeah, and I think, two interesting, I think we're probably both tech optimists, but two interesting thinkers that maybe push us to consider the other side might be Nick Bostrom and Eric Weinstein. And Eric on the portal talks about, humanity basically has this cube, which is new tech, and we pull things out of the cube, but some of them, we don't really put them back. And so we don't know if there's one that if we take out, could be, a massive threat to civilization that actually can't get put back in. So found that interesting. I think Nick Bostrom, both on the simulation theory and on some of the thing about potential catastrophic societal risks. Again, these are, I don't want everyone to be a perma bear on tech, but it's interesting to get to think about that side of things. And I think it's great that you have such an interest in both policy and tech and ethics. And I think hopefully, if we can bring that, I don't know how, I don't really know the solution, right? But bringing more of that ethical thinking to the forefront, trying to ingrain it in the incentive system,
Yeah.
be a way to roll out this new tech. But probably a good time if you're ready. We can go into some of these rapid fire ones.
Sure. Sure.
So, first one's, who's been one of your most important mentors? And the caveat is, if you remember a specific action they took, or
Yeah.
something they said.
Yeah. So I actually have a lot of what I would consider peer mentors, which I think are underrated. So it's basically like a lot of close friends, and in very different roles than me, that I ask for advice that I think either look at things in a really unique way or are in a role that will give me different perspectives. Like I have a lot of close operator friends or founder friends or even friends from when I was dancing. So I try to get a variety of perspectives. I think the other person who's probably like closer to a mentor is actually my dad, who was a founder, and then he was an investor later. But I think, yeah, he's just somebody who's, been through this and for decades basically. And so I think it's dated, right? Because everything changes so fast. And so like what being a founder in the 90s is not like being a founder today. But I do think as an investor, having more of like the founder operator perspective is really important.
And next question is, outside of Playground, what's another VC? Could be a firm or a specific partner that you really like what they're doing.
Yeah. So I would say, like, as an investor that I admire, I really admire Anne Muraco at Floodgate. I just think she has really great frameworks for how to think through investments. Particularly, I remember one conversation of hers that I heard was about like identifying the core assumptions that you need to believe to be true, and kind of a framework for doing that, since especially at the early stage, like a lot of these companies are going to pivot. So what can you get comfortable around given the high degree of change at the really early stages? And then I also really like Mike Maple's work on also at Floodgate on how to think about breakthrough technologies. I thought the article was really good. I admire like the compound team because I think they do really good thesis development research work. I just like that because of my background. And then I think you have funds like Founders Fund or the other deep tech funds. Always appreciate and admire people that think similarly to Playground in terms of how to allocate capital to things that are important to society.
Definitely. And when you look at startups, what are some of the characteristics that get you, pretty excited about a business?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think so. This is always like cliche, and I always heard everybody say this, but I've been learning more the importance of like the team and their background, and I think particularly like founder market fit. So, what does this team or founder either understand about the problem or like, have the relevant experience in order to like tackle that problem. So I think team is I can't really believe I'm saying this because I always used to like hear all these investors say that, and I'd be like, oh, that's so bogus. But I think it's really true. I think like when we're looking at deep technology, like some of the things that we look for, like can this leverage existing either processes or just manufacturing processes or distribution networks, or does everything have to be built bespoke? Because obviously it's great if you can leverage the capital that's already been deployed into developing these things. So that's one thing. I think like as generalizable or widely applicable as these things can be, is obviously better and something that we look for. And then I think the other thing is like, is there especially with deep tech where you're maybe taking more technical risk, are we comfortable with kind of like the roadmap of what the different milestones will be at different stages of funding, and if those can be, de-risked before the next round or whatever. So basically like testable hypotheses and milestones that point towards a kind of like de-risked but credible path to the end state.
And last one here on the rapid fire stuff is, what are some of the top like podcasts, books, and blogs, both in like venture and then just like in general, that you've explored?
Yeah. So I think with all this stuff, like I knew it felt like this for sure with crypto, but it's like deep tech in general is like having trusted sources, or like, there's a lot of noise and like basically like garbage about a lot of these topics. So blockchain at Berkeley was that for me when I was first starting out in crypto. I knew I could kind of like go to those people, or they would point me to like credible resources. Now there's like great stuff like Andreessen has the crypto canon. I know Electric Capital's put out some great stuff. Sheet 256 has like a beginner's guide for crypto. So all that is great. I think this is like very basic, but like MIT Tech Review, I think is very credible. Wired, I think is like pretty high quality. And then I'm on like too many newsletters that I can't even remember what they are. So yeah, I don't know. That's not really a revolutionary answer, but
No, those are all great sources. Before we have some of these outros, recent guests told me that I should give everyone an opportunity to throw a question my way. So open invitation.
yeah. So I mentioned before that this role is kind of different in that it's very undefined, and it's somewhat ambiguous. So would love to know like what have you learned, I guess, in the first year or two of doing the role, and or like another way to ask that question is like, what advice would you give to somebody who's been in the role for say a year?
So I will say, when I started at Fund of Funds that did co-investing, Greenspring, and it was actually fairly structured. We were working a lot on the DD side, the diligence, less on the sourcing, because the sourcing was built into the model. Invest in the funds, co-invest in some of their best companies in the later rounds of those companies. And so, when I shifted into early stage, that's when I kind of felt the open-ended nature. And what I really relied on was, I had a short experience interning at a startup that I really loved. And at that time, I was in between sales and engineering, trying to take complex, open-ended potential deliverables, work with the engineers, and like drive actual change on the platform. And so I think I've relied on what I remembered from that experience, some of the design thinking work I've done before, and I rely heavily on the team, mentors within the firm, mentors. Like you said, I think it's underrated to have mentors at your own stage that are in the same exact situation as you
Yeah.
help out. And I think everyone struggles at the early stage with the ambiguity and balancing the time and trying to figure out like if, and there's such a long curve to all this. It's like you could go for 8 years before you have any indication of how good you are as an investor. I mean, your investment could just be a 1x
Yeah.
the whole time while you're waiting to find out what happens. So I think just, yeah, kind of working together with everyone and relying on some of the, I guess, gut instinct from prior creative and startup work. So great question. Okay, this is one that I stole from Tim Ferriss. I really love it. And it is, what is a purchase of like $100 or a couple hundred that's had like an outsized impact of happiness on your life?
Yeah. So probably I get free weights, I guess, like during the pandemic to be able to still stay fit and active at home. That's not even $100. It's like less, but yeah, to be able to maintain that while not being able to go to the gym or whatever, it kind of like keeps me sane. I'm definitely someone who needs to be active every day in order to be in order to be in a good mood.
Yeah, no, that's a great. I've had a couple other people answer. A lot of people do like fun, like little random purchases, but other people have like mentioned fitness stuff too, and so I think it just shows how important it is for doing right now. But lastly, please promote yourself. Where can people find you on like Twitter and LinkedIn and other places as well?
Yep, I'm on definitely on Twitter. LinkedIn Medium is where I publish a lot of my thoughts. Those are the best ways to get a hold of me.
Awesome. Well, really appreciate the time today, Justine. It was an amazing conversation. Hopefully we can do it again soon. And yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Have a great day.
Looking to innovate, invent, and disrupt? We're your partner to fuel your growth. Contact us to learn more.